Hello there yet again, and welcome to the third video in our three-part video series on how to beat the SAT essay. You may have noticed I have used the same cover image for all three of the videos because I think it looks awesome. That kid really looks like he's enjoying writing his essay, or I don't know, whatever he's working on. He's clearly getting into it. Hopefully you will too, if and when you have to write the essay, which actually leads me to the next screen and a brief recap of the things we've talked about in the earlier videos. So like I said, this is the third video in the three-part video series. If you haven't watched the first two videos, then I recommend you do that before watching this one, because the other videos go into more detail on what's going on with the SAT essay and specifically how you should attack it and all of that kind of stuff, and we're not really going into that level of detail here. So that first video covers how the SAT essay is designed and how I recommend that you attack it, and why you shouldn't pay any attention to the scoring rubric that's provided by the College Board, and all kinds of other fun stuff like that. And one other thing that's really important that's in the first video is the idea that you may not even need to try to get better at the SAT essay. And I'm not saying that because you're already like perfect at it or anything. I don't know. I'm guessing you aren't, or you wouldn't be watching this video. But if you're thinking that colleges and universities will care what your SAT essay score is, and if that's why you want to get better at the SAT essay, which it probably is, then you should definitely watch the opening of the first video, in which I explain to you that most colleges and universities don't care about the SAT essay at all. And even the schools that do require that you submit an SAT essay score, which is like less than 10% of schools right now, even those schools, if you look at their admissions data and all of that kind of stuff, it's pretty clear that most of them aren't looking at this essay score at all. Which means that if you want to do something for standardized testing that will have a very strong likelihood of positively impacting your chances of getting into any particular school, then you should be focused on the multiple choice portion of the SAT, which schools care about a lot. It's kind of like actually sort of an inverse situation. A lot of schools claim they don't really care about the multiple choice part of the SAT, and they're just sort of requiring you to submit test scores for no reason. But if you look at their admissions data, it's pretty clear they care a lot about the multiple choice part of the SAT. And then on the other hand, some schools claim that they want you to submit the SAT essay, but if you look at their admissions data, it's pretty clear they don't actually care what the score is. Anyway, I keep repeating that idea. The point is, if you want to go learn more about it, watch the first video. In the second video, we talked about the ideas of evidence and reasoning and emotion and those types of things, specifically as they apply to the SAT essay, and the ways that you can use them to sort of structure your thinking while you're going through the passage that you'll be analyzing in the SAT essay. And then now, in this video, we are going to look at some top-scoring SAT sample essays provided by the College Board as examples of things that test takers have written that scored high in the past, so that you can see how the ideas from the first two videos are at work in actual SAT essays. But before we dive in and start looking at some of those specific sample essays, I just want to run through a brief refresher of some of the ideas from that first video on the types of things that you should be doing as a test taker when writing the SAT essay. So you'll recall from video one, we talked about the importance of using the College Board's idea of what the thesis of the passage is, rather than reading the passage on your own and trying to figure out what you think the author of the passage is arguing. And we also talked about the idea that you want to say that the author of the passage made an effective argument, or did a good job, or successfully argued something, successfully defended a position, something along those lines, just because top-scoring essays always say that, so you should say it too. We also talked about the idea that the length of the essay is the single largest indicator of what the score is likely to be, and you'll need to write at least 2.5 pages in order to have a solid chance at getting a perfect score. We also discussed the idea of the 5-paragraph format, or more accurately, the modified 5-paragraph format. The number of paragraphs isn't actually that important, but I'm calling it a 5-paragraph format because it's still intro paragraph, and then some number of body paragraphs, and then a conclusion paragraph, sort of a take on the standard American high school 5-paragraph thing. And to be clear, you don't have to write an essay in the 5-paragraph format in order to score perfect on this test, but gosh, why wouldn't you? Because generally the ones that score perfect are in that format, so why not, right? We know the graders like that format. And as we discussed in the first video, our goal is basically to copy all of the elements that are always appearing in top-scoring SAT essays, so that when the grader looks at our essay, they'll be like, oh, this has all the stuff the top-scoring ones generally have, so great, top score. And one other thing we talked about that appears in top-scoring essays, actually, are small mistakes in things like word choice, grammar, spelling, even all that kind of stuff. These are the types of things that many test takers would sort of automatically assume would be likely to hurt your score, because in school and in college, those types of small mistakes can sometimes hurt your score, depending on how your teacher likes to handle that kind of thing. But on the SAT essay, you will find that many high-scoring essays have these types of errors, and it doesn't stop them from scoring high. And we also talked about the idea that you want to shoot for roughly 10 to 15% of your essay to be made up of quotations from the passage that's presented in the prompt. And with all of that in mind, in the first video, I laid out roughly a sort of high-level, step-by-step kind of approach I would recommend that you take on test day when you actually try to write the essay. And we said that step one, which is almost kind of not even really a step, it's sort of like step 0 or pre-step 1 or just sort of a background process you keep in mind while you're doing the other steps. And that is to remember that length is absolutely critical. You have to write at least 2.5 pages, and you don't have a ton of time in which to do it. So everything you're going to have to do on test day, you want to do as quickly and mechanically as possible. And in a minute, when we see some of the top scoring essays, you'll sort of get a sense of what I mean. And then actual step 1, or the first thing that you do while you're remembering what's currently on the screen, is to find the College Board's statement of the passage's thesis. So we talked about the idea that there's going to be some sentence in the prompt which says something along the lines of, in the passage, the author argues that, blah, blah, blah. And whatever is in that sentence after the word that is the thesis as far as the College Board is concerned and as far as you are concerned as the test taker. And then with that thesis identified, you're going to read through the passage and observe the way the passage uses evidence and reasoning and emotion. If you're not totally clear on what I mean by those things, then you can watch video 2, which was all about evidence, reasoning, and emotion, at least as they apply to this discussion. And then while you're going through the passage and looking at that, you're also kind of thinking, okay, which types of evidence am I seeing appearing in this passage, and what's the reasoning that sort of connects that evidence back to the thesis or the main argument. You're kind of noting that stuff because you're going to use those ideas to craft your body paragraphs. And then when you're starting to get a pretty strong idea of which types of evidence and things like that you want to talk about, you actually dive right in and start writing the essay. I don't recommend that you do a lot of planning because, again, the time is limited. And as you'll see, there really isn't a ton to plan. You already know you're going to write the 5-paragraph format. You already know the thesis is going to go in the first paragraph. And you know roughly that each body paragraph is going to be devoted to either a certain type of evidence or a certain type of an appeal to an emotion. And you can kind of focus on each paragraph as you're writing it. So there's really, again, not that much to plan, which is why we just dive right in and write the opening sentence. And in that opening sentence, I recommend that you use a quote from the passage and find some way to say that the author succeeds in arguing whatever was the thesis according to the College Board. And then you sort of flesh out that first paragraph in the same way that you might do it for school. And of course, you'll see examples of how some of the top scoring sample essays do that, but basically flesh out that first paragraph, possibly referring to ideas you're going to mention later in the body paragraphs if you want, or possibly just finding ways to reword and restate what you said in the opening sentence if you can't really think yet of what you want to put in the body paragraphs. And then when that first paragraph is completed, you're going to dive right into your first body paragraph, which is going to be based on some sort of evidence that you noted in the passage. And when you finish that first body paragraph, you're going to go right into the second body paragraph, possibly the third, fourth, however many evidence paragraphs you want to add in there, keeping in mind that you need to write at least 2.5 pages and you need to wrap the essay up within the time limit. And then after you've done your evidence-based paragraphs, you're going to write your emotion-based body paragraph. Again, see the video on evidence and emotion, which was video number 2, if you're not exactly sure what I'm talking about when I describe these body paragraphs. And then finally, for your concluding paragraph, the last paragraph in the modified 5-paragraph format, you're just going to restate the things you've discussed so far in the essay, kind of wrap it all up in a bow, maybe include 1 or 2 more quotes from the author, and call it a day. So you have now been refreshed on the main things that top scoring essays have in common and on a process for generating those things for yourself in your essay. And so with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and dive in and start looking at actual top scoring sample essays provided by the College Board. But before we do that, let me interrupt myself because I just want to be really clear and say that you don't have to follow every single detail of what I say in order to get a high score. And you'll see in just a few moments that the top scoring essays we look at do a lot of the things that are mentioned in these videos, but they don't all do everything. Instead, it's more like what I'm teaching you here is an abstraction of the things that the College Board generally rewards. So this is not the only way to write a top scoring essay, but it is, in my opinion, the most effective way to do it, the most predictable, reliable way to do it, and the easiest way to teach and learn that still will result in a top scoring essay. So again, what we've been talking about up to now is the way that I recommend you go about writing a top scoring SAT essay if your goal is to maximize your score with as little invested time and energy and effort as possible. And as an example of that kind of thing, you'll remember that in the training we talked about the idea of dedicating one body paragraph to talking about the author's use of emotions or pathos or whatever. And you'll see in a few minutes that one of these essays we're about to talk about, instead of doing it that way, actually chose to like discuss emotional appeals kind of all throughout their discussion of the passage. And that, of course, can work fine if everything else in the essay is done well. But the reason that I teach it the other way, like combining all the emotional stuff into one paragraph, is that that's usually easier for most test takers to do. So again, you'll notice that in some ways the essays we're about to talk about don't follow every single thing in this video to the letter, but that shouldn't dissuade you from following what I've laid out for you in these videos. So with that in mind, let's take a look at one of these essays. The first one we're looking at got a 4.34 from the College Board. You may be wondering what that is. It kind of sounds like a weird score in Olympic gymnastics or figure skating or something. But without getting into too much detail, basically, let's just say that a perfect score on the SAT essay would be a 4.44, the way that the College Board reports the sample tests anyway. And so this one with a 4.34 is like basically perfect according to the College Board, but off by 1 point. And by the way, if you're wondering, why does this say 4.34? Like maybe you've taken the test in the past, you happen to recall that all the section scores were out of 8 the time that you took the essay in the past. That's because when you do the test in real life and you get your actual full score report back, it will be graded out of 8 because it's looked at by 2 people and blah, blah, blah. But for some reason, the College Board, in putting out the sample tests, decided just to give the score out of 4 points instead of out of 8. And there's really no like logical purpose behind that. It's just what they did. So the important thing for you to know looking at this is a very high scoring essay, but it's not a perfect scoring essay. And the reason we're even bothering to look at an essay that's high scoring but not perfect is that the College Board hasn't put out a ton of sample essays for us to look at. So in order to have more than one, basically, to look at, we couldn't limit ourselves to just the only 4.44 that's put out as an example. We had to also look at this 4.34. And the passage that this essay is referring to is available on the College Board's website at the time of this writing. It's an essay by a person named Bogard, B-O-G-A-R-D, who talks about the importance of darkness and nighttime and avoiding light pollution and that kind of thing. So we couldn't fit that entire passage on the screen plus the essay we're going to be discussing. And really, the content of the passage has very little to do with our discussion of the essay anyhow. So if you want to read that passage, you can go on the College Board's website and find it. Or if for some reason it's not there when you're looking for it, just Google like Bogard and darkness or something. And I imagine you will find the source that the passage was taken from. But really, for our purposes, just for test prep purposes, beyond the basic background I just gave you, you probably don't even need to read the source passage in order to understand what's going on in these essays and how the characteristics of these essays affected the scores that they were given by the College Board. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at this 4.34 essay that I was talking about. And by the way, I called this sample essay 1 because it's the first one that I'm going to talk to you about. But if you look for it on the College Board, you will see that it is called sample 7 because it is the 7th one that the College Board talks about. So anyhow, you can see at a glance that this essay follows the 5-paragraph format, basically, that we talked about. Here's paragraph 1, paragraph 2. Well, you can count paragraphs, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's 3, and here is 4. And then the 5th conclusion paragraph is present also, of course. And you'll notice that the final sentence of the first paragraph is a thesis statement in which the author has laid out the 3 things that are probably going to make up the body paragraphs we'll see in just a second. In other words, the 3 types of arguments that are made in the passage. I'll call them A, B, and C. And those are, in this case, personal observation for credibility. Stirring feelings would be the second one. And startling facts. And so, yeah, we're going to find that this first body paragraph is about the personal observation. The second body paragraph is the B paragraph, stirring feelings. And startling facts looks like this is going to be this paragraph over here. By the way, I'm just labeling these as A, B, and C to keep them separate from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So A being the first body paragraph talking about personal observation, B being the stirring feelings one, the second body paragraph, and C, these startling facts being this third body paragraph. So yeah, so there is the thesis statement describing how Bogard does that. Notice also the thesis statement says that Bogard's argument is powerful. Remember, we said that you want to take the position that the author did a good job making the argument in the original passage. You will also, by the way, find that stated up here in the opening sentence. of this paragraph. Let's go ahead and read that sentence, actually. So Paul Bogard, a respected and passionate writer, offers a convincing argument on the importance of allowing more darkness to fill the earth for distinct health and ecological reasons. So you can see that this sentence is just like a kind of long, slightly rambling recap of everything that happens in the original passage. It's just sort of a general intro sentence describing what the passage was about and honestly just taking up space, which was a smart thing for the writer of the essay to do. And then here in the second sentence of the first paragraph, we have just another sort of general rambling sentence that's vaguely related to the ideas in the original passage about light being important, but darkness also being important, and so on. And then finally, again, that thesis statement that we mentioned, which calls out the specific topics that we're going to see addressed in the body paragraphs. And so going into the body paragraphs, we see the test taker starts with a quote about the author's childhood, which is actually kind of a bit long of a quote, and then just adds a few sentences here talking about how this quote affects the reader, basically just saying that, the reader reads this quote and then feels the same way that Bogard feels or felt or whatever. And so, yeah, that is the personal observation type of evidence paragraph. And now the second body paragraph here about feelings talks about how the author evokes emotion. Remember, we said you want to mention emotion, address emotion. In this case, the author of this essay has done that in the second body paragraph. Of course, as you recall, in my suggested way of doing it, you would write it in the third body paragraph, but it really doesn't matter which order those body paragraphs appear in. I just find that doing it as the third body paragraph is easiest for most test takers to keep in mind. But anyhow, we just see here a couple of different quotes pulled out from the original passage. And then after each quote, a relatively straightforward description of how that quote evokes emotion. In fact, you can see the phrase evoking emotion up here. I already mentioned it in the first sentence. And then down here is also the phrase through the emotion Bogard evokes. So yeah, just kind of constant repetition of how different quotes evoke emotion. And then finally, this third body paragraph talks about how the author of the passage uses facts as a type of evidence, which is a pretty broad statement, but also accurate. There are plenty of facts presented in the original passage. And we can see here that the author quotes those facts pretty heavily from the original passage, and then just kind of talks about the impact that each quote has. For example, here, Bogard extends the argument beyond humans, allowing us to see that darkness does not only have an impact on us, but all of nature. So again, just sort of a generalized description of what each fact-based quote is doing. And then that's it for the body paragraphs. And finally, we have a concluding paragraph, which is relatively short and just sort of sums up the things that Bogard said in the passage. Now, there are also a few mistakes here in terms of grammar, diction, usage, the kinds of things that most literature or history teachers would grade you off for if you submitted this essay in a classroom situation. And I want to go over a couple of them now, but I want to be clear, I'm not doing this as a way to criticize the test taker who wrote this essay, because among other things, the practical situation presented by the SAT essay test is just ridiculous anyway. It doesn't really give you enough time to proofread or research or do any of the stuff that you would actually do if you were a serious writer. So in no way at all am I suggesting that the person who wrote this essay should feel bad about the mistakes that I'm about to point out. But I want to point these mistakes out because it's important for you to understand when you go to take the test that you can have small mistakes here and there, and the grader will not penalize you for those. And most of the mistakes in this particular essay have to do with just sort of like unnatural kinds of phrases. Here's one, for example, with light providing as such a huge factor in daily life, rather than just with light being an important factor in daily life or something along those lines. We don't normally say providing as, just from an idiomatic standpoint. And there's also, like here, for example, this phrase, through his childhood memories, we lean our ears to listen to him, which gives a clear impression of what the test taker probably means, but is definitely not a normal way to express an idea like that. Like, we physically can't lean our ears to do something through someone else's memories. So again, if you were to submit this in like a high school or college situation, the teacher would probably say, well, maybe tweak that phrase. It sounds a little bit off, but you'll find that it doesn't have any kind of negative impact on the SAT essay score. And here's another example. Actually, Bogard strikes the people who disagree with him. He doesn't literally strike them, and it's not really like an expression in English to say that you strike somebody if you disagree with them or issue a counter argument or anything. And I'm not going to go through the rest of the essay and point out any more of these phrases, because once more, the point is not that the test taker did anything wrong or bad. The point is just that you shouldn't spend any time worrying on test day whether you're turning a phrase slightly weirdly or misspelling something or putting a verb in the wrong tense or any kind of thing like that. And so there you have it, a pretty high-scoring essay. You may be wondering why it didn't get a perfect score. And of course, the grading process is a little bit opaque, so we can't know for sure. But if I had to guess, there are two things going on here that I think may have prevented this from having a perfect score. And by the way, you may be listening to me say this and thinking to yourself, you don't have to wonder. There's like a written explanation from the College Board about why this didn't get a perfect score on the website. That is true. But those written explanations are not reliable. If you look at what appears in those written explanations, you will see that the written explanations are not consistent and reliable descriptions of what actually succeeds in SAT essays. In other words, if you were to look at the written explanation for the 434 that was given to this essay, and then look at essays from other test takers, you would find that other essays might have been given a 444 or a 424 or a 333 or something, and would still possibly be accurately described by the written description of this essay. Which is all just a convoluted way to say that I don't recommend you put any stock in the College Board's written explanations for its essay scores because they offer no predictive value. So anyway, back to theorizing as to why this actually did get a 434. My two guesses would be, if we look at the first and last paragraph, we see that the author kind of strays a little bit from what the main task of the SAT essay is supposed to be. As you'll recall from the earlier training videos, the main purpose of the SAT essay is not for you to give your opinion on the topic in the passage, but rather for you to discuss and explore how the author of the passage puts forth their opinion. But in this case, the test taker, especially in the concluding paragraph here, the test taker is talking more about whether the test taker agrees with Bogaard's position and not really about how Bogaard puts that position forward. So in the body paragraphs, we see a lot of discussing of how Bogaard puts things forward. But again, in that concluding paragraph, it's more the test taker coming forward and saying, I agree with Bogaard, and I think that we should see the strength and beauty and darkness and so on. So that's one thing that might have resulted in a point being dinged here. And that could kind of make sense with the whole idea about how quickly these essays are read, because we can expect that a reader is more likely to linger over the beginning of the essay and or the end of the essay, just because that's kind of human nature when reading or consuming any kind of information, is to pay more attention at the beginning and the end. So maybe that was part of it. Another possibility is that this essay kind of relies heavily on quotes to fill out its length. This is like, I don't know, just looking at it, it's not quite half quotes, but it's probably a third or more quotations, which is generally a bit higher than what we see for the top scoring essays. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the grader saw the quote percentage and was like, oh, well, I would have given it a perfect score except for all these quotes, so I'll just ding it 1 point. I'm not saying that that happened. What I am saying is that the writer of this essay may have spent so much energy and time on quotes that they ended up not devoting enough time to explaining what the quotes are actually doing in the eyes of the person who graded the essay. So anyway, those are two theories on that. We'll never know for sure unless we happen to meet the person who actually graded this essay, which is highly unlikely. If you do meet them, though, please ask them these questions and send me an email. I will definitely appreciate it. So this was sample essay 1 for us. And now we will take a look at what I am calling sample essay 2, which, again, in the College Board's website is actually called sample 8. But I'm calling it 2 because it's the second one I'm showing you, and they called it 8 because it's the 8th one that they show you. So this essay did get a perfect 444 from the College Board, and it's written on the same passage as the one we just discussed. Of course, this thing about Paul Bogaard and how important it is for darkness to exist and stuff like that. So you'll notice this essay is also in the 5-paragraph format, I believe, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look at that, 5 paragraphs, just as we will typically encounter in top scoring essays. And you'll notice the opening paragraph here is constructed in a way that's pretty similar to the opening paragraph that we just saw, and indeed to the opening paragraphs of most top scoring essays. The last sentence here is the thesis, which says he effectively builds his argument by using a personal anecdote, allusions to art and history, and rhetorical questions. And just like in the essay we just looked at, this person gives sort of brief mentions of the concepts that will be explored more in the body paragraphs, the types of evidence and so on that are going to be discussed in the body paragraphs of this essay. And without bothering to read those paragraphs yet, I'm going to go ahead and guess that this one is the paragraph with a discussion of the personal anecdotes. This is going to be the paragraph with a discussion of allusions to art and history. And this will be the paragraph with the discussion of rhetorical questions, probably, when we get there. Now also notice that the thesis says that the writer of the passage does an effective job of building an argument. Remember, we keep talking about how the top scoring essays universally say that the author of the passage did a good job in writing the passage. Now here we only have really a 2-sentence opening paragraph, and oh, actually look at that, a 2-sentence closing paragraph too. But that's fine. The opening paragraph, like we said, includes this thesis statement, which is in an easy place for the grader to find. And then we also have this intro sentence, which is just sort of a general statement about what the passage is all about. It mentions the author of the passage, his name, and the name of the passage, and just a brief rundown on how the passage is about the fact that natural darkness should be preserved. So a relatively easy paragraph to just sort of churn out here. It's the thesis plus a basically meaningless recycled opening sentence. And that's not meant as a dig against the test taker. The test taker was smart to just sort of mechanically create an opening sentence like that. I suggest that you do the same thing. But I'm pointing out that it is just sort of a mechanical, empty, meaningless opening statement because I want you to recognize that that's what it is and to realize that when you start writing your essay, you can just dive right in with a sentence basically like that, mentioning the author's name, the basic idea of the passage. If there is a name for the article of the passage, then mention that too. You know, that's a perfectly fine way to churn out an opening sentence. So anyway, in this first body paragraph, which I, for some reason, have labeled A, in keeping with what I did on the previous essay, labeling that first body paragraph A as well, we see a mention of this personal anecdote, the time that Bogard was apparently spending a summer in the woods. And the test taker has given us that quote, and then a few sentences describing what that quote does to the mind of the reader. Now, notice here, this test taker is kind of sprinkling in the emotional stuff into this paragraph and sort of combining it with a discussion of the evidence, which, like we said, is something you can do and still score very high. And so we see the author mentioning here the potential for beauty, glamour, and awe-inspiring mystery. This is probably the most obviously emotionally directed phrase in this paragraph. And yeah, again, that's fine to talk about emotions sort of interspersed with your description of each type of evidence in the body paragraphs, if you like. And then in the second body paragraph, we have a description of how Bogard refers to art and history with some quotes sprinkled in here about the city of light and so on. And then a couple of statements about how these quotes further his line of argumentation, which is just a fancy way of saying strengthen his argument or demonstrate his argument. And we do have some kind of oblique references to emotional responses to things, but finding things, for example, undoubtedly beautiful, things being grand and glorious, or on the other hand, consumed by unnatural, vapid lighting. So the test taker doesn't come out directly here in this paragraph and talk about how this is an appeal to emotion, but the test taker is sort of using emotionally laden terms on their own in this paragraph. And then finally, in the third body paragraph, we see the exploration of rhetorical questions as a type of evidence. And there's a quote of one of the rhetorical questions, what the vision of the night sky might inspire in each of us and our children or grandchildren, question mark. And we have some more reference to emotion here when we talk about how that rhetorical question tugs at the reader's heartstrings. And notice in this sentence that the test taker does come out and call the rhetorical question an appeal to pathos, which, as you remember from the earlier training videos, is basically just another way to say an appeal to emotion. And then finally, we have the concluding paragraph, which basically restates the ideas from the other paragraphs and repeats the three types of evidence that were mentioned. So once more, you can see this concluding paragraph is fairly mechanical. It almost writes itself, especially after the rest of the essay has been done. It's basically just the author saying, and let me remind you of all the things that I just said. And we can see in contrast to the first essay we looked at that here in the concluding paragraph, the test taker is still talking about how Bogard built the argument, not about whether the test taker agrees with Bogard's argument, as we saw in the previous essay we just looked at. And so, yeah, that is basically what the College Board considers to be a perfect scoring essay. By the way, while we're here looking at this perfect scoring essay, I want to mention a few small mistakes that the author made in terms of grammar or diction or those kinds of things. And I want to emphasize, just like we did with the first essay, that I am not doing this to say that the writer did a bad job. In fact, you can't say the writer did a bad job because the writer's goal in writing the essay was to get a perfect score, I assume, and the writer got a perfect score. And so that's it. The writer did a perfect job of accomplishing their goal. So the small mistakes and grammatical, stylistic issues and so on that I'm about to point out, I'm only pointing out to reassure you that it's okay for you to make these kinds of small mistakes on test day, that they won't stop you from getting a perfect score. And there are honestly several phrases in here that most English teachers would probably pick out as being not great. I'm not going to bother going through all of them, but I will point out a few. So here the writer talks about fully amassing themselves. They probably meant to say fully immersing themselves, immersing, immersing, rather than amassing. But again, the grader didn't take any points off for that. And then we have like this redundant phrase, darkness void of artificial light. Darkness is void of light. Pretty redundant to write that. But again, it didn't affect the score of the essay at all. And there are several other, kinds of phrases like that. But the last one that I want to mention, I guess, is this word guttural, which is actually not a word. Probably, I'm guessing what the test taker meant is guttural. But whatever it is, the original version that's here is, again, not a word. And even if it were a word, the idea of adding guttural power, if that is indeed what the test taker meant, that idea doesn't really mean anything or make any sense. It's not a common use of the term guttural or power or add. So it would sound a bit off for that reason as well, even if it were spelled properly. But again, the reason I'm pointing it out is not to take any issue with the fact that the test taker did that. I'm just pointing it out to prove to you that it's perfectly okay for you to make those kinds of small mistakes, and you shouldn't waste any time or energy on test day trying to proofread for those kinds of things or worrying about whether what you're about to say is a little bit off. Instead, you should just keep in mind the profound importance of generating the necessary length in your own writing and just steamroll right through any of those small concerns. Do your best to write down each phrase as it seems right to you, and trust that the graders are not going to ding you for those kinds of things, as you can see again that they didn't ding the author of this essay. And so, yeah, that is basically it. So we've now looked at 2 sample top scoring essays from the College Board. I want to remind you again that my advice is not based only on these 2 essays, obviously, but also based on the experiences of the many clients that I've worked with who have written the SAT essay and shared their experiences and results with me. And so once more, this is not the only way to write a perfect scoring essay, the way that you've learned in this video, but it is the approach I strongly recommend you follow because it's the easiest and most effective way to crank out a top scoring essay without spending days and weeks of your life worrying about it. And by the way, actually, let me close this video series by reminding you one more time that the vast majority of colleges and universities don't care if you submit an SAT essay score at all. And even of the ones who say that they care, if you look at the data from their admitted classes every year, it seems pretty clear that they are, misrepresenting themselves and that they don't actually pay any attention to your SAT essay score, and they only go through the motions of requiring it in the first place because they don't want to come across as being a school that doesn't care about whether its students know how to write essays and stuff. So don't sweat this stuff too much is the bottom line. If you are going to sweat it, then you now have all the tools to crank out a top scoring essay, just like the ones we've just finished talking about. All right. Thank you very much for watching all this stuff, and I will see you in the next video.